Welcome to our talk show on empowering the green recovery. My name is Claire Dool. Over the next 45 minutes, we're going to be discussing how small businesses can rebuild from the pandemic in a way that prepares them for the looming climate crisis. The International Trade Centre has just launched its SME Competitiveness Outlook 2021 report, and I shall be discussing some of the key findings with the Executive Director, Pamela Hamilton, who's with me in the studio. We're also going to hear from small businesses in Uganda and the Philippines, as well as from some key players who, like the ITC, are empowering small businesses to go green. We'll be taking questions for the Executive Director throughout the show, so do put them in the chat. And, of course, do tweet, as well as tagging at ITC News and using hashtag Climate Action and hashtag MSME Day 21. But first, a short video to set the scene.
Empowering the green recovery. What does that look like? Putting small businesses at the heart of pandemic recovery, ahead of the next crisis, climate change. Small firms make up 90% of businesses worldwide and more than half of all jobs, so their resilience matters. New research from the International Trade Centre shows that resilient companies were 5 times less likely to lay off employees during the pandemic and more likely to have stable sales. A resilient company can withstand disruption because of its strong business processes, internal and external connections, and ability to respond to changes. Best performing companies had key business fundamentals in place, such as good inventory management, a diverse network of suppliers, and a focus on research and development, to name a few. The fact is, small businesses are more vulnerable to shocks, whether the pandemic or climate change, because they display fewer fundamentals of business resilience. But it doesn't have to be this way. Small businesses can rebuild in a way that prepares them for future shocks and at the same time strengthens their core by going green. By going green, small firms can seize new business opportunities. Nearly 60% of African companies that invested in greening their enterprise said it led to new, higher quality and more products, access to new markets or lower input costs. Small firms in developing countries are among the most concerned about climate change, even if they are less likely or less able to address those risks. Women and youth-led companies in particular lag behind in adapting. So small businesses can't do it alone. Business support organisations, governments, lead firms in value chains and international organisations have roles to play. With a network of partners and by investing in the right business fundamentals, small firms can emerge more competitive, resilient and green. The SME Competitiveness Outlook 2021 lays out a 20-point plan for key players to empower small businesses to drive the green recovery.
And we're going to learn more about that 20-point plan later on in the show. But first, I have a question for Pamela Hamilton, who's the Executive Director of the International Trade Centre. Welcome, Pamela.
Thank you, Claire.
And I'm just wondering, what do you see as the lessons for SMEs from the pandemic? Mm-hmm. And how can we apply them to the climate change crisis, which many people think is going to be even more disruptive?
Yes, thanks so much, Claire. I think fundamentally, when we look at the context of competitiveness and resilience, we found that there are relational factors, and those companies that are more competitive also tend to be more resilient. And there are certain fundamentals that underscore this. The first one is that the business processes are sound. So good bookkeeping, record keeping, sound inventory management, and also ensuring that you have at least a business bank account. The second area was in connectedness. The fact that if you're connected to business support organizations, if you're connected to your peers, if you're connected to more diverse supply chains and also organizations like ITC, you're able to withstand and be more resilient in bad times. And then the third area is looking at how adaptable are you? How responsive are you to change? How willing are you to adapt new methods, new technologies? Those three factors are very important in terms of the fundamentals. So we focus on the fundamentals. The second issue is how important is it for you to ensure that you have timely, accurate, clear information on how to make the green transition. Many companies, especially SMEs, do not have that. And so one of the things that we work on is how do we ensure that you actually are able to get this information. And what we found also is that the same fundamentals that are important for SMEs in the COVID crisis are just as applicable in climate change. So the things that make you resilient during COVID were also the things that make you resilient in the context of climate change.
So getting the fundamentals
Yes.
right. Some SMEs, of course, in the developed world, as well as the developing world, will say there are prohibitive costs in going green. So what's the business case for them?
Well, you know, I would say this. The business case is sound not just because we say so, but we've looked at as we say, the fundamentals. We've looked at the fact that once you begin to target investment in certain green transition, you develop resilience. You increase your resilience across the board because you're investing in change. And the truth is, it's analogous to whether you're in the digital world or not. Life is changing, and if you don't adjust, you're going to get left behind. The other thing that is very important is its cost reduction and also higher productivity. Most of the firms who were able to invest in green transition, in eco-innovation, actually lowered their production costs. And for countries like mine, Jamaica, or from island states that have such high production costs, this is important. And it also increases their level of productivity because they're able to reinvest in their companies. The third area is that they're also able to access new markets because more sustainable consumption, there's more demand for that. There's more demand from lead suppliers or lead companies to have this come in. So they also would require that there's compliance with these new climate adaptable measures. And then finally, it also enables them to access green financing. And there's a lot of green financing now available. So that's an important aspect. So that's why the business case is important and it does work.
Well, let's come back later in the programme to green financing. Sure. But what I'd like to do now is to introduce two SMEs who have successfully gone green. So Chimunjili Fashionability in Uganda is a social enterprise which makes clothes and accessories from recycled plastic. And it employs people with physical disabilities. And its founder, Juliet Namuji, told me earlier that the idea came to her when she saw the discrimination that her father faced when he was disabled in an accident.
We came up with the idea called Chimunjili Fashionability and to fight for the conservation of the environment and inclusion of people with disabilities. So ever since I was young, I was so passionate about being the fact that I saw the difficulties that my father went through as a young child. So that's why I came up to fight for the rights of people with disabilities, those who are seen as a curse, those who are discriminated, those who are always in poverty, to really give them hope that they can make it.
And Juliet has really given hope to hundreds of people with physical disabilities who work for her company. Of course, with the pandemic, sales have declined and she hasn't been able to expand at the rate that she had wanted. And you can find more information about Juliet's story in the ITC report. So now let's go to the Philippines and to Jamiko Jamlang, who is the CEO of the Bamboo Company. Now, his company aims to replace household items with those used or made of bamboo. And he pivoted also during the pandemic and offered bamboo facial masks, dispensers and soaps. And earlier he told me what he saw as the opportunities and challenges in going green.
For businesses going to green, they're the one who is usually right now being chosen by the consumer. Like for example, for us, so instead of them choosing plastic items or choosing those that are not sustainable. So they opted supposedly to choose our product, and with that, it created some opportunity to boost in terms of the revenue and the market share.
What is your biggest challenge as a green business?
To be honest, the main help that we will be needing is more on the capital, because as I said earlier, in terms of the technology that we will be needing to be able for us to scale, one thing that is really needed is more on the capital. So this one, we're looking for investors and other institutions that could help us in terms of financing the technology.
What is your advice for other companies wanting to go green?
Going green is not easy, but I think that challenge would push you further, because along the way you could create and see the impact that you're creating, not just for the communities and the society that we're living in, but also the things that we will be having in the future, especially that we have experienced a lot of things in the past years that is related to the environment. So going green is really the way forward for businesses and to create opportunities to help and protect our environment moving forward, and to ensure that we will have a great future ahead.
Well, you heard there from two SMEs who are really embracing the idea of economic, environmental and social sustainability. And small businesses can drive a green recovery, but they need support. And in the ITC report, they identify 4 key sectors, which are international organisations, governments, business support organisations, and lead firms in the value chain. So, Pamela, let's start with the international organisations.
Sure.
What role do you see for them?
Well, ITC, I can speak on our own behalf. We consider the transition to green recovery as one of the defining elements of our time. It is going to be one of the most critical changes since the Industrial Revolution. One of the things that we have done is that we have started and launched the Green to Compete strategy. And we have a 3-pillar approach. 1, looking at reducing the impact of climate change. 2, looking at enhancing biodiversity. And 3, looking at promoting the circular economy. And so what we've also done is we've set up Green to Compete hubs across the world that help to actually multiply the impact and the work done in further greening. So we work at the ecosystem level with business support organizations. We work with SMEs themselves in helping them transition and actually, look at their own, assess their internal mechanisms and how they can make the transition. We also work at the international organization level with financing to see how we can work on improving green financing and helping them to access it. So those are the kinds of factors that we engage in. Those are the levels that we work at. And we try to ensure that we build out a mechanism and a framework that enables small and medium-sized enterprises to do the green transition.
As Pamela was saying there, it's really about having this network of support. And she was mentioning business support organisations. So I'm delighted that we can be joined by the CEO of Procomer, which is an export promotion agency in Costa Rica, which really sets a vision to make trade sustainable in Costa Rica. And we're joined by the CEO, Pedro Berruti. Pedro, welcome. And please tell us a little bit about that sustainable vision and how your organisation supports SMEs to go green.
Sure, Claire, and hello, Pamela and everyone. Costa Rica is not going green. Costa Rica has been green for the last 40 years. And definitely that has been our competitive advantage. Our journey started probably 70 years ago when we decided to abolish our army and bet on people, bet on education, bet on sustainability, instead of betting in fighting, in arms, etc. So we started preparing teachers instead of soldiers, buying books instead of guns, And that helped us realize that it was very strategic to protect our environment. Therefore, as a result, we started to create national parks. We made it prohibited all oil exploration, mining, and the country became a green country probably 4 decades ago. As a result of that, we have enjoyed a lot of tourism who comes to Costa Rica to enjoy the volcanoes, the beaches, the river, the wild forest, the rainforest, the biodiversity, and all that. But also we have been very successful attracting large companies because they want to be in a country that is green. And also what we're seeing these days post-pandemic is that buyers from all over the world want to buy from countries that are green. Our exports are growing 20% compared not to last year where we had pandemic, compared to 2 years ago where we didn't have pandemic. So for us, it is definitely a competitive advantage to be green. But it's not just about green for us. Our vision these days as a trade promotion organization is to have what we call the 3 Ps, people, planet, and prosperity. So of course we have the planet there, but that's part of our DNA. For us, it's now also about having social impact, and it's about building prosperity. But I insist, for us, it's not of course, sometimes it gets more expensive to go green, but on the long term, it's truly a competitive advantage because you can sell more, you can attract tourists, you can attract investors, and for us, has been
And can you tell me, Pedro, absolutely, Costa Rica is a real green country, as you have so eloquently explained to us. Can you also briefly explain the sort of practical support that you offer to SMEs?
Yes. So first, we have a 360 approach to our SMEs. Like any other country, we have most of our companies are SMEs. We're a small country, and SMEs are very important. So we go from educating SMEs and where the competitive advantage to financing SMBs and dropping a seed capital for them to go into this green transformation, into this green mantra that they all should have, because we, as Pamela said, realize that is the way to attract new buyers, to differentiate from other countries that are lower in cost, and to charge a premium for our product. So financing, educating, attending with a green concept to all international fairs and events are just few examples of the things we're doing to remain perceived as a green country with green companies.
Thank you very, very much for outlining all of the support that you give. Now let's move to another key sector, which are the lead firms in the value chain. And I'm delighted to be joined by the CEO of List and Beisler, which is a German specialty green coffee company, which is long established and which practices sustainable sourcing and business practices. And the CEO is Philipp von der Goltz. Philipp, just tell us briefly about your sustainability vision and, very importantly, how are you supporting the suppliers in your value chain?
Hi, Claire. Thanks for having me on the show. Hello, Pamela. Also from my side. Well, List & Beisler is a company that has been trading high-quality coffees for 120 years. And I think this proves a little bit the importance of sustainability also from our side. Because being in the market for 120 years in a very complex market shows how interdependent all of us are. And this includes, for and most importantly, the farmers in the producing countries. Coffee is a crop which is mainly produced by smallholders. We're talking about 12.5 million farmers or farms worldwide, which are not, let's say, high professional farms. They are small plots of land where people grow the coffee that we all enjoy. And our company has been also on an evolution, growing the sustainably produced coffees. And we differentiate here between such coffees under certification schemes, but also, and this is my major passion, those coffees that we develop together with partners into sustainability. And we have one beautiful project going on together with ITC, Alliances for Action, where we actually source the truly heart of Ethiopian high-end specialty coffees and bring them to the European and US and also other markets in the world. We are jointly training 1,800 farmers in south of Addis Ababa in best agricultural practices, and also what Pamela was mentioning, training them about the basic financial literacy in order to understand better the dimension of their actions from a financial side. Yeah, and this will open, that's our aim at least, also the possibility to bridging or giving them access to finance in a later stage.
And Philippe,
so
sorry to interrupt you, but I was just thinking about that Alliances for Action initiatives, because that also produces this coffee exporters guide. And could you just very briefly, because I would like to take some audience questions in a moment, just explain how that guide can support SMEs?
Yes, well, that's a beautiful project. Again, a project we're doing together with ITC and the Alliances for Action. And basically, I'm one of the co-authors of this new edition. It's the 4th edition of an existing guide, which basically explains SMEs in the countries of production how to produce coffee and access international markets. And this guide does not only end up in the hands of new cooperatives or new farmer associations, but also into the hands of policymakers in coffee producing countries. So the new Minister of Agriculture gets into power. So we hope he or one of his assistants has the guide in his hand and understands how modern value chains for coffee work, and where sustainability is an intrinsic part of a modern supply chain and of a modern product to a certain extent. It becomes another layer of the quality of a product. So this is a joint approach that we are doing. We're hoping of having a huge impact there with the joint effort. And it proves, I think, one important change in the last decade, which is going into from competition more and more into a collaboration space. And we are happy to have these collaborations in place.
Well, thank you very much, Philip. Thank you, Pedro. Do stay with us. I'm just going to take an audience question that's come in for Pamela, which is, why aren't all small businesses going green?
Okay. Frankly, it's a very good question. Why not? Because it's obvious, isn't it? There are two factors. One has to do with cost. The fact is that the cost of going green can be prohibitive for very small enterprises. And this is understandable. You have to do sunk costs between 25 to 30,000 just to make the transition maybe to solar panels or to other. But you can undertake less prohibitive things like looking at greening your building. So, for example, changing out LED lights, doing things like water capture. So things that don't cost that much up front. So that's the first issue, the cost. The second issue is the fact that governments tend to not necessarily put in place the incentives that enable them to, to go green. If they're tax incentives, maybe they will look at it and decide, okay, you know what, this works for me. The other issue is looking at, what other kinds of market access opportunities that this will create. So we have to do the pull factor instead of the push, right? And I think those are the key issues. How do we enable them to take advantage of it? How do we lower the cost that's associated with actually, going green? And also promote the opportunities and the advantages of going green.
Well, do keep on submitting your questions, because we are going to take them throughout the show. And I think that's a very interesting question, because Pamela referred to it earlier, and so did Pedro and Philip, this whole idea of access to green financing. So let's look at this challenge, which is in the report.
Yes.
How is there a lot of green financing around, first of all, and how do we make sure that the SMEs can access it?
There is quite a lot of green financing, actually. You know, the Green Climate Fund, several other funds out there. The biggest problem we have, and ITC works on both sides of the financing equation. First of all, we work with SMEs. We work with SMEs to help them design investable projects. One of the complaints we always get from financiers and banks is that we don't have bankable projects. You know, it just won't fly. So one of the things we do is we work with them to actually develop investable green projects that can actually become eligible for financing. And we do these through our green SME boot camps, and basically work with them at that level to enable them to design these projects. We also work on the side of the financiers themselves, because one of the other difficulties we faced, and I can say this for the Caribbean, is that even though the banks are extremely liquid, billions of dollars sitting there, they have not worked out a methodology to apply value to greening. And so when a small enterprise goes to the bank and says, look, I'd like to, get solar panels or do LED or do, insulation or move to production based on alternative energy, they haven't been able to quantify unless you can give them collateral, which is hard. And so the ability to translate the idea and the concept into hard cash is one of the difficulties. So we work with the financiers as well to see how they can do it. And the third thing we do is we do matchmaking. So we look at the supply side and the demand side, and we try to map what is out there, collect that data, and make it available to SMEs so that they can try to access this financing.
So I imagine that it's all about access, and Pedro, your organisation, as a mediator, perhaps between banks and lending organisations and the SMEs. How do you help your SMEs in Costa Rica get access to this green financing?
Yes, definitely. Our mission is to be part of helping the country develop this inclusive and sustainable growth. Within that, the finance factor, it's key, right? As Pamela said, there's more green funds available, but there's not methodology, and there are still some old bank practices on how to access these funds. What we're doing is the matchmaking, even with the banks and with the companies. We help SMBs build a case, build a pitch that will make sense for a bank, that will reduce the risk of a bank. And the bank see us, the TPO, as a partner that is helping the bank, to reduce the risk, because they know that we can help these SMBs then matchmake with buyers. We're also promoting green entrepreneurship. I think there's a huge potential there, not just to attract more funds, but also to born green, not just become green, but like SMBs need to born green. These days, we are in Costa Rica are promoting what we call a plant-based economy, meaning that you can develop products out of plants, out of agricultural waste and things like that. And the eyes of the world are on that, right? We're seeing more and more interest from global financiers that this plant-based economy will be the future, that is huge potential, and that is on top opportunities for SMBs.
Thank you, Pedro, there. So another issue that was raised in the report was regulation. So, Pamela, according to the report, 1/4 of SMEs see regulation as an obstacle. And in your report, you say, think small first when designing and implementing regulation. So can you give an example, and can you tell us how prevalent is this? Are governments doing it? Are they thinking small first?
The truth is, regulation is not bad in and of itself. It's necessary, and it's required more and more as we seek to combat climate change. The issue is it can be prohibitive, can be restrictive, and it can be very difficult for SMEs to meet these requirements. So what we suggest and what we promote in the report is thinking small means, first of all, assessing what the impact is of the regulations that you're putting in place. And once you've made that assessment, be proactive in trying to help them actually meet these regulations. One of the things, for example, is looking at creating carve-outs for green public procurement, so that a consortia, say, of small and medium-sized enterprises can actually get together and meet, the public procurement market, which is a huge market. We can also look at tax incentives for greening your building and having depreciation as part of that. So therefore, the faster you green, the greater the depreciation, and therefore the less your taxes. Looking at, for example, technical assistance to go green. What can they do to help these small, medium-sized enterprises? So in other words, putting in proactive measures that actually help them meet the regulations and also engage in innovation themselves. So these are the kinds of things that we mean by, think small. Just think about them. Keep them in mind when you're putting in place these regulatory measures.
And are they thinking about them?
Well, Costa Rica is. And I think more and more countries are. More and more countries are looking at the fact that, SMEs are 90% of all businesses. And so at the end of the day, if you don't work with your SMEs, then it's going to be very difficult to do the change that's necessary. And I think they recognize in meeting their Paris Agreement, commitments, they have to begin at that level, at the SME level. So.
Now, another issue that's raised in the report and has been referred to in their opening remarks is certification standards. And there's a proliferation of these. So I'd very quickly like to hear from Pedro. I mean, for small businesses, sometimes they can be a bit sceptical about certification schemes. They can see them as a barrier to entry into the market. How do you help SMEs navigate the proliferation of certification schemes?
Yes, definitely we're seeing a proliferation in certifications, and the challenge with them is that some of them are, as I said before, prohibited in terms of cost. So our advice to SMBs and the way we help is by identifying and choosing the right certification that will become a competitive advantage to them. Rainforest, fair trade, the things that make the company not just demonstrate quality, but also demonstrate that it's a sustainable company, because that's what is differentiating the Costa Rican company from others. So we, in some cases, support financially part of the cost of that certification. And in others, we attract other entities, corporations to help SMBs pay for this. But we think certifications are necessary. They are good for us because it's also the way we can demonstrate that we are green, that we are sustainable, that we have social impact, that we're doing fair trade with our growers, with our producers. But yeah, it is a challenge to keep a balance between not too many and not too expensive, which is not having anything at all.
Philippe, I'd like to bring you into the discussion here because you mentioned certification schemes. And there is this issue that there's a proliferation, and that can be very confusing for small businesses. What's your view on that? And how do you help your suppliers deal with that?
Well, I think in coffee we've seen certifications for a long time already. And we are, I think, maybe in a step of some sort of consolidation on a certification front is already happening. Like Rainforest is merging with UTZ, and so there is some movement on that front. And I think the work done in the past by certifications was very good and brought us into a situation where we can now look at the whole sustainability complex from another point of view, a more mature point of view. And we have our line of thinking goes more into something we call beyond certification, which is already a next step of development, which is at the end of the day only doable because we have already a certain level in the coffee industry.
Tell us very briefly about that concept of beyond certification.
Well, this would be something like I mentioned beforehand, where we start developing projects that go that go deeper than just a certification, where you start developing farmers into best agricultural practices, when you start touching subjects such as financial literacy and the importance of understanding farming as a family business and not only as an individual concept through which we manage to give more importance to the role of women and the whole farming part as well, is something that is also, let's say, to a certain extent, a further development on what certifications usually only cover.
Thank you, Philippe, getting some insight into your idea of beyond certification. We'll take some audience questions in a moment, but of course, we've been talking about these challenges, access to finance, regulation, certification. But of course, none of this can happen, for better, for worse, unless there's connectivity. So what are you doing to try and tackle that problem?
Well, we look at the connectivity from two sides. One has to do with the connectivity digitally, which is what we found is that the companies that were able to pivot most quickly to e-commerce were the ones who were able to survive this pandemic in a better way. So that's the first thing. The second thing, we still look at connectivity as well with relation to the BSOs, the ecosystem of business support, and ensuring that, you know, normal networking and peer-to-peer understanding and access to buyers and suppliers is also part of it. One of the difficulties with the connectivity issue is that there's still 4 billion people unconnected. And why? It turns out that it's not so much that they aren't covered by mobile broadband, but the issue of cost. And how do we address the cost factor, the affordability for these persons, for SMEs to engage in the market? So this is one of the areas that we're also working on to try to ensure that we can encourage governments to enable connectivity, lowering the cost, providing the infrastructure that enables them to access the online marketplace, because that is a huge opportunity that's missing for so many of the people. And so for SMEs, this is going to be a critical aspect also of their competitiveness, of their ability to go green, and also to take advantage of the markets that will be open once they transition to green. So those would be the...
Thank you very much for those ideas. And please do keep your questions coming in. There's one here that I see, Pamela, a forward-looking question. Of course, everybody's thinking about the COP26 in November in Glasgow. What would you like to see come out of that in terms for small businesses?
Okay. I think the first thing I'd like to see is that they're actually on the agenda. That would be helpful.
Are they not at the moment?
We're not really clear what the agenda is, because there's so much in the Paris Agreement, and with the US now rejoining, it's going to be an exciting time, I'm sure. So the first thing is to ensure that the issues that affect MSMEs especially are taken into account. At the level of the companies, to look at what are the factors and the mechanisms that can be put in place at the broader level to enable SMEs to access their supply chains and enable them to work. At the country level, what are the elements that countries need to put in place in their business support system, in their financing system, to enable SMEs to take advantage of this green transition and actually benefit. In other words, it needs to have a business side, not just a government side. There needs to be an attention paid to what small and medium-sized enterprises will face moving forward.
Of course, governments take their cue from the World Trade Organization.
Yes.
And for some time now, I think the Environmental Goods Agreement has been stalled.
Yes.
How could that help SMEs?
Well, the Environmental Goods Agreement, particularly in relation to small and medium-sized enterprises, could be a great opportunity because it provides the kind of regulations and measures that will allow SMEs to access new markets, to provide new goods, and hopefully provide carve-outs for very small enterprises. It's a pity it hasn't gone very far, but we're hopeful that once now with the Paris Agreement back up and running with COP26, that there will now be a new impetus within the WTO for this to move forward.
And I think within the WTO, there is this joint initiative on micro, small and medium-sized
Yes.
businesses. Does that include greening SMEs? Perhaps you could give us an update on that.
It was just launched. I mean, it was late last year, I think October. So the MSME, it's an informal working group. I think right now they're just beginning to flesh out what they will cover, how they will approach the issue in the context of the WTO, how they will engage with small businesses. It's very new, so I don't think that they have been able to move into the whole issue of green or, other factors. Basically, they're still working, looking at the framework of how MSMEs and their issues will be considered in the context of WTO agreements.
Here in Europe, we're hearing a lot about the EU Green Deal.
Yes.
And one of the key things in that is the carbon border adjustment tax that's being discussed. What impact do you think that could have on SMEs?
The good thing about the carbon border adjustment tax is that it's focused more on high intensity carbon emissions. So, for example, steel, aluminum, primary products, generally commodities, are not included. So that's a great thing for most LDCs and small countries and small and medium-sized enterprises. And so thus far, it should be okay. We will see how it works out, because in any negotiation, in any process, there will be winners and losers. But the hope at this point is that it will be focused more on the large emitters, the really, big industries.
Interesting. Well, thank you very much, Pamela, for talking about this report and the recovery plan and how important it is to have this network, but also giving us a bit of insight into what's happening at the World Trade Organization. I would also like to thank Pedro Beruti, CEO of Procomer, and Philip von der Goltz, CEO of List and Beisler, for joining us live, as well as entrepreneurs Juliet Namuju and Jamiko Jamlang for their contributions. Thanks to our audience also for tuning in on Facebook and LinkedIn and for sharing your questions with us. Now, this talk show kicks off a series of events focused on small businesses in the run-up to the Micro, Small and Medium-Sized Enterprise Day, which is celebrated globally on the 27th of June. So do check out our website at www.intracen.org. That's all from me, Claire Dool. Goodbye and thanks for watching.